It's always a pleasure to be able to share with you some of our most illustrious scholars and thinkers on things strategic, and to be working with Dave in regards to what I think is one of the very best, if not the best, military museums in Canada. And so I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to come to this event, which of course is a continuation of a series that we introduced last year. So this is the first one of this term, and we're very happy to have all of you here listening to these very important thoughts. Before I introduce the speaker, of course, I would like to make the territorial acknowledgement. The University of Calgary, located in the heart of southern Alberta, both acknowledges and pays tributes to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Pilana and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chitnak, Bearspaw, and Good Story First Nation. The city of Winnipeg, I'm really showing my biases here. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nations of Alberta, District 5 and 6. Before I introduce our speaker and the topic that she's going to be addressing, I would also like to give you the commercials of the next coming events. The next Highlander speak, it will be on Wednesday, November 27th, and it will be by Dr. Ian Brody, who will be speaking on the life cycle costing for defense purchases is nonsense, makes us dumb, and helps our enemies. He doesn't like controversial topics. And for those of you that don't quite recognize the name of Ian Brody, he is a colleague of mine in the Department of Political Science, but his job before becoming a member of our department was, of course, his employment as Chief of Staff for Stephen Harper. So he has been tied in. He has seen the system as he moves over. And so once again, will be a very good event to be coming. The other event that I'd also like to showcase is that on November, and Mary, am I right, 14th and 15th? Yep. Okay, all right. So on November 14th and 15th, we will be hosting a very large two-day conference on the RCAF 100-year history. So part of it will, of course, be a historical overview of the RCFI, looking at its impact. We have one panel, just to whet your appetite, of former Cold War pilots. They're going to be able to come in and talk about what it's like. We have Billy Finn coming in. He is, of course, the leading test pilot and speaker for the F-35 program. We have the former commander of Northern Area will be telling in some of the areas here in terms of his experience in terms of understanding the Arctic dimension of what we've had to do. So if you are interested, I have to warn you, we just opened up registration and we're quite happy with how quickly it's filling up. But go to our webpage if you are interested in registering and make sure that you do get registered early for it. Okay, moving on to tonight's topic. This is a topic, I've got to say, is just wonderful to see developing because it's so critically important. This is something, by the way, way back, I'm not going to tell you what year, I did my master's thesis on this topic, except they were called strategic minerals. They weren't called critical minerals at that point. And I was convinced of how important it was, but no one else seemed to believe me. So it's wonderful to be able to see the type of expertise that we're going to be having tonight to discuss it. So Dr. Elizabeth Steyn is an assistant professor of law at the University of Calgary, where she teaches courses including critical minerals, regulatory frameworks, and geopolitics and business and human rights. She is a board member of the Canadian Institute of Resource Law, an international committee member of the Foundation for Natural Resources and Energy Law, and a member of the Natural Resource Law Teachers Institute. Her research focuses on critical minerals, responsible mining, environmental justice, impacted communities, and deep-sea mining. Now, I got to tell you, we were at a conference together where we discovered that we both had an understanding of this critically important topic. I can assure you the issue of strategic/critical minerals may not be a subject that you know too much about yet, but it is a subject that is going to be central to the security of the Western world in the manner by which we are able to achieve and to address the fact that our enemies are aware of that and we need to start being aware, is going to be all sorts of very important information that we are going to share. So we are privileged to hear of who is now becoming one of Canada's leading experts on this subject. And so, Elizabeth, it's my honor to bring you up and share your thoughts tonight.
Oops. Thank you so much, Rob. Can everybody hear me? Am I in the speaker? Because I can't hear anything. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Rob, thank you so much for the kind introduction, for the invitation to the museum. Thank you for hosting us. And to all of you, thank you so much for your attendance tonight. It is my great pleasure to address you on this topic. I am giving it a flyer because I'm not so sure exactly how au fait everybody is with the topic of critical minerals. So forgive me if it is too simplistic, and forgive me if it is overly complex. Here goes. I want to tell you a story about the intersection of mineral power and military prowess. For a very long time, we have been used to thinking about minerals in the sense of hydrocarbons. In the sense that whoever controls oil and gas has a lot of mineral power and therefore a lot of military capability. But actually, this is a relatively new phenomenon. If we go back a couple of centuries, we see that it was metals and not hydrocarbons that was really so important. My contention here tonight is that we are returning to that scene with the energy transition and therefore with critical and strategic minerals. A note on terminology. There are various phrases that are used for these same elements, materials. Whether we say critical minerals in Canada, critical and strategic minerals in Australia, critical materials, depending on which list we're talking about in the United States, it can be critical minerals or it can be the electric 18, if we follow the Department of Energy's list. The European Union talks about critical raw materials, but basically everybody has the same thing in mind. We're talking about elements like lithium, cobalt, the battery metals, energy transition kind of minerals, but not only the energy transition. Just by way of a quick introduction, I will come back to that. I am giving you a synthesized definition of what critical and strategic minerals mean to most nations. The actual meaning is really dependent from place to place and from time to time, because this is determined by every nation for itself. These lists also are not static. They are added to on a regular basis and also subtracted to. But if we look at them, they mostly share three basic characteristics. First, that these materials share a critical functionality. I'm just going to stop dancing around minerals and metals for a moment. Do we have any geologists in the audience? Yes. Okay. Why am I smiling? Because the geologists will not like the fact that I'm talking about critical minerals when I refer to metals. Very briefly, I am sorry, but the lists are called critical minerals. It is not my intention to muddle critical minerals and metals. The ores are the minerals, the metals are the end product, but we don't dig up the metals ready for use. That's in a nutshell. Okay, so critical functionality is one of three things in terms of most of the lists. Energy transition is the big reason that is normally given for all the increase that we are seeing in mining and the renewed reputation that mining has these days. There's also the digital transition, things like semiconductors, AI, the Internet of Things, all the metals that are needed for that, gallium, germanium, elements like that. But then there's military security, defense purposes, which is precisely why we are here tonight. So, to tease out the military security portion of these lists is less easy because, of course, no government comes out and says, these 15 elements on my list are the military application part of the elements, whereas the others are energy transition minerals. This is part of the strategic portion. The second characteristic is that there is an economic scarcity quality. So there's a distinction between scarcity and rarity. I give you the example of rare earth elements. Rare earth elements are not really rare. We find them all over in the Earth's crust. But finding them in mineable quantities is less easy. Also, it is extremely polluting to refine them, to get them out of their ores. There's often radioactivity that results in the process. So, rare earth elements are economically scarce, but they're not rare. China controls a great percentage of rare earth elements because, well, they produce many, but more importantly, they refine almost everything. Then the third characteristic is supply chain vulnerability. So supply chain vulnerability, we have seen already with COVID the impacts on supply chains. With critical minerals, it is so much more serious because let's take the example of something like even silver. Silver is used in solar panels. It's not particularly scarce, it's not particularly rare, but if you don't mine it, if you don't produce it in your country, and you need it for solar panels and you can't get it because the sea lanes are all occupied, because there are blockages, because there are wars going on, then you can't make solar panels. Rare earth elements. If China has an embargo and you cannot make the little magnets that go into the wind turbines, then you have a problem. More importantly, you can't make ballistic weapons without the rare earth elements. So that is supply chain vulnerability. This is my very broad overview of critical and strategic minerals. Now, there are profound consequences if we have an inability to source them. First off, if inevitably the energy and or the digital transition is imperiled. But with that, the economy is rendered vulnerable to disruption. So, and the military capability is subject to degradation. But what I'm saying here is, yes, of course it has military implications, security implications in the physical sense. But it also has energy security implications if we can't get our supplies of critical minerals. In other words, even if a mineral doesn't have immediate military security applications, if it's an energy transition mineral that we are speaking about, it can imperil the economy of a country if it cannot get hold of that. So why am I talking about these energy transition minerals? Because we are looking at vastly vastly accrued numbers of minerals that will be necessary. This data comes from the International Energy Agency. It's a 2022 report. You can see here how they are saying the adoption of electric vehicles is going to be staggered between now and 2040. Now, I want you to bear, and with it also battery storage, because of course you know the intermittency problem with renewable energy. It needs to be stored because you don't necessarily want to use the energy when the sun shines or when the wind blows. I want you to keep this graph in your mind for a moment while I show you the next slide, which is the fact that an electric vehicle consumes 6 times as many minerals or metals as a regular vehicle does. So if we are going to have so many more electric vehicles, can you imagine how many more minerals we are going to be needing? Together with that, if you look at the energy sources here, natural gas and coal, and we don't even show oil here, but even nuclear, because the energy is denser, consumes less minerals, fewer minerals, proportionally to generate a kilowatt hour than what we find with offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar. So again, to create the infrastructure for this renewable energy, and I'm not against renewable energy, I'm just giving you some facts here. To create the infrastructure, we need a lot of minerals and metals. I can give the slides to Rob if anybody wants them. None of this is classified. So, that being said, I want to take you back to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is where we really see a case study of metals being necessary. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to share with you the fact that in my previous life as a baby prof in South Africa, I was a teacher of Roman law. I never thought the Roman Empire was going to come back to haunt me. But it did, lo and behold. The Roman Empire was as successful as it was, and I show you some of the metal they used, because of the fact that everywhere they went, they were able to conquer new territories with mines, with metals. They could kit their armies out, and they could conquer other territories going on further. There's a fascinating study by Humphrey of the ancient Roman Empire. It's actually not only the ancient Roman Empire that he studies, but that's his starting point, where he shows empirically that Rome's military might was dependent on the availability of metallic weaponry. So he demonstrates that Rome used raw materials on an unprecedented scale to build and sustain its power. That short sword that you see there is called a gladius. One of them required 2.6 pounds of iron ore. So now, a legion typically comprised 4,000 to 6,000 men, with an equal number of auxiliaries, all needing to be armed. That is 14.4 ton of iron ore per legion. At the height of Rome's power, there were 30 legions, meaning 432 tons of iron ore. This was not a one-off requirement because the weapons tended to get used up, and they also corroded with time. But they also used iron for agricultural use, and they used it for tools. They mixed lead and tin for tableware and kitchenware. They used bronze, which is copper and tin, for use in armor for household goods and ornamentation. Silver formed the basis of their coinage, the denarii, which crucially they used to pay their soldiers with. And then gold they also used in coinage, but more generally in ornamentation. Now I give you some stats there, I'm not going to read all of it, on the metals that they used at the peak of their empire. Bear in mind when you see that, they had no mechanical equipment in the way that we have these days. We're talking surface mining, manual mining here. So no sophisticated tools. They couldn't reach a lot of the ore, and this is what they mined. Rome, however, was a city-state. It had no resources of its own. So it could only obtain the minerals it needed to grow and sustain its power through territorial expansion, which it did. Originally, it traded with Etruria, which is the modern Tuscany, for copper, bronze, and iron. But of course, it became too tempting, so it invaded Etruria instead and took the copper, bronze, and iron. Now, the Roman Empire was particularly well suited towards precision organization, which it did. So it really optimized the running of those mines. It sent in slaves and everything. So they produced a lot of metal. While we don't know whether the fall of the Roman Empire was caused by the lack of metal, we do know that their silver and gold ran out because their denarii were depreciated quite a lot towards the end. And we know that with the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, the whole mining industry fell into the Dark Ages where it stayed for the next 1,000 years. So we move swiftly onwards to the United States of the 20th century, which is where I really want to be. Because this is where we find the next major superpower. And here I'm drawing on a 2024 study undertaken by Wisher and Bazillion. Now, there are 4 potential sources of mineral supplies. 5, really, if you want to take territorial expansion into account, but the United States is playing by the rules, so we don't take territorial expansion here. Domestic production and government stockpiles are your 2 most secure sources because that is within the country's control. Domestic production, by 1913, the US led in the production of 13 out of 30 key minerals, and it ranked second in the production of an additional 4 minerals. Thus, in 1915, it accounted for 60% of global copper production and 32% of global lead and zinc production. Government stockpiles. This is where we see the first critical and strategic and critical materials stockpiling act, as Rob will tell us. In 1939 in the US, this act formally established a stockpile. However, I'm saying 1939, so of course they diverted that stockpile for World War II, and the real stockpile only came into existence in 1960. But there was a significant stockpile in place. We don't know exactly how much they have now because, of course, they don't tell us, but we know that they have a stockpile. United States companies also boasted significant mineral production abroad, including control over major mineral resources throughout the Western Hemisphere. Thus, they predominantly owned or operated the largest copper mines in Canada, Chile, and Mexico. So by the late 1920s, the 4 largest US copper companies represented more than half of the world's copper production. Finally, aligned imports, particularly from the British Empire, meant that jointly the US and Britain controlled 75% of global mineral supplies by 1938. 75% of global mineral supplies by 1938. Which brings us to China in the 21st century. Now, I think a picture speaks more than 1,000 words, so I invite you to look at this, which is particularly the refining potential of China. This is a publication from McKinsey that appeared a few days ago about the concentration of global supply chains. These are all critical minerals, very often, frequently used critical minerals. They appear on all of the countries' lists. Here you see the production. You can see China appears on quite a few of the production as well. This is the leading country that they're listing. But here is the refining. China is first on everything except platinum, which is South Africa. Similarly, if we look at mine ownership, Chinese investors, backed by the Chinese state, have radically increased their market share over the past 10, 20 years. So China is the blue here, and we're showing three elements, lithium, nickel, and copper. And you can see here with lithium, for instance, how much their market share has increased. Now, it's of importance that this is backed by the Chinese state, because this is not something that we often do in the West. So, China, domestic production. By 2022, China assumed the top position in the production of 30 out of 50 minerals listed as critical by the United States. 30 out of 50. This was in 22. In 23, December 23, China's Natural Resources Minister announced plans to intensify their efforts in mineral research, exploration, and extraction. Stockpiles. They have substantial resources of stockpiles because what they do is they purchase from domestic producers in China and then they stockpile it. We don't know exactly how much they have because evidently they don't publish it, but we know that it is a significant amount because they are safeguarding against external supply disruptions. Overseas production. This is the graph I just showed you with their investment in domestic companies. Imports from aligned states. Well, China imports substantial quantities of minerals from states with aligned commercial interests. For instance, rare earths, 40% are sourced from Myanmar, and much of its lithium is imported from Australia. But it's imported from Australian companies in which China holds a share. It also purchases cobalt from the DRC from both organized mines and artisanal miners, because of course they don't have the same value system in terms of environmental and human rights as the West has. And then finally, territorial annexation, empire building, which we know is illegal under international law, but nonetheless we have seen much aggressive posturing by China vis-à-vis Taiwan, which is the world's biggest manufacturing of semiconductors, chips, in the Central and South China Seas and in the Arctic. So if you look at this slide, this is a 2017 report from the International Resource Panel. But look, from all of the continents, the only one that has massive growth in terms of extraction is Asia and the Pacific. And I can guarantee you it looks much worse now. So the US hasn't just sat back, it has taken some measures. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA, and the Defense Production Act. And these are used, they are funding provisions and tax incentives meant to encourage US manufacturers to use locally sourced supplies and also to bolster domestic supplies of minerals for the US military. But there are many people who say it is too little too late. If we look at the Chinese measures taken, they have industrial policies promoting domestic production, domestic processing. Very aggressively, they are encouraging Chinese companies to invest abroad, and they are cultivating very close economic and diplomatic ties. So, what are the policy options for Western governments? First, domestic production options. To expand financial supports for domestic exploration, mining, and processing. We have a problem with NIMBYism, not in my backyard, where many of the developed countries would prefer the developments to take place in the global south, and the global south is saying they've had enough, with reason. Secondly, to expand support for secondary production, in other words, value from waste, recycling. And thirdly, to explore government procurement options and tariffs for domestic production. I'll come back to tariffs. They can also bolster national stockpiles. To the best of what I could discover, we do not have a national stockpile in Canada. Thirdly, to enhance overseas mineral production by national firms. So I've seen some shocking studies on subsidies given to other entities, not national entities, to produce minerals abroad. And then finally, to augment aligned imports through long-term offtake agreements. So you only want to do this, of course, in terms of minerals that you are not producing domestically. Otherwise, there's competition with your own. There are people who say the US should simply refuse to export technology to China. But China has a tit for tat in that. They've so far announced export controls on gallium, germanium, both used for semiconductor chips, graphite, used for batteries, antimony, which is used in solar and also in wind turbines, also in lead-acid batteries, but that's of less importance, rare earths, which they control, as well as rare earths processing technology, because China has wised up to the fact that everybody wants to refine their own by now. I leave you with two final thoughts. The one is, well, many of the big ores, the big reserves, resources have been mined out. The really fruitful places to be found are Africa and Latin America. Here you can see with the last Africa-China conference, China offered Africa $51 billion in fresh funding and 1 million jobs. This is not a offer that was made by the United States or any of the Western countries. And I leave you with the quote of the UN Secretary General at the same conference, who said, "The China-Canada partnership can drive the renewable energy revolution." Thank you so much.
Wow, talk about shades of deja vu back from a fellow who was back in Carleton in the 1980s when we were first addressing this issue. I'm sure that we have lots of questions for Elizabeth, so at this point I'd open up the floor for questions. Yes, at the back, Dr. Stapleton.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the potential for conflict in this China-Africa partnership over minerals, because you mentioned DRC. Eastern DRC has been in conflict for decades now. It's often said that the cell phone revolution caused the Congo War in the late 90s, early 2000s. Is there going to be now, electric car wars in Eastern DRC? I mean, wars are continuing there, but maybe they will be bigger, maybe they will spread.
Frankly, I don't think China cares. Yes, there may be, but if you look at the infrastructure for concessions model that China has been following in Africa, and the loans that they've been calling in, I'm thinking specifically of the port of Zambia here, just to tell everybody. So Zambia defaulted on a loan to the government of China, and China took the port of Zambia. So China now owns the port of Zambia. You can imagine they control that whole access route. They don't play soft or easy in Africa, and it's a language that many African countries understand. What I will say about the Chinese approach in Africa is it has been very successful because they tend to lend money without political strings. There are other strings, but not political strings. As to wars, Dr. Stapleton, you are the expert, not me.
Yes.
Well, thank you for this very informative talk. You presented a really striking picture of how things are right now and how they've been changing. And I guess my question has to do with maybe ask you to think a little bit about how things should be from the policy perspective. And I wonder if one possible reading of or implication of your presentation, you mentioned that for the West, questions of human rights concerns in the relationship between extractive industries and local populations are front and center. They're very important. And of course, that's not the case for China, where it presents lots of money and the human rights engagement with local communities is just not a priority. So would one of the implications of your talk be that the West should be less concerned with human rights, should be more concerned? How should we think about that?
I think I like the approach of IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which is a coalition. Okay, so there are industry organizations like the Mining Association of Canada and the International Council for Mining and Metals who have standards, but that's all industry organizations. IRMA is an organization that has as stakeholders communities, workers, mines, end users such as jewelry houses, vehicle manufacturers such as Tesla and Volkswagen and Mercedes and so on. They have insurers, they have financiers. Oh, I've got everybody as stakeholders. So all of these people sit around a table. Everybody has 2 representatives and anybody can veto. It takes them long to make decisions, but it's effective. Now, IRMA is saying we should put a premium on responsibly produced metals. And I agree with that approach, because this is the only way that we will eventually be able to distinguish. So we use the example of a consumer paying more for organic goods or grass-fed beef, because it's a responsible, it's a moral choice that you're making to buy that product. Eventually, the choice will have to be with the consumer. Knowing, let me explain it like this. You can buy an electric vehicle, but your electric vehicle is only as green as the fuel that you put into it. It's only as clean as the battery metals that have been put into it. So if your nickel in that battery comes from Indonesia, then likely it comes from deep ocean tailings. So the messy residues have gone into the ocean, which is very polluting. And most of the world's nickel comes from Indonesia. So it's a very bad thing. So if you can get Canadian nickel, which does exist, which is responsibly produced and with good community relations, good environmental standards, and you know that that has been tracked, and they use blockchain, that has been tracked cradle to grave, then you know you can ride in your electric vehicle with good conscience because the electricity you put in is hydro or nuclear or whatever, it's not coal-fired, and the nickel in it is not problematic.
Well, just a brief follow-up. I guess, that's a good answer from the perspective of a North American or a Western consumer, but I guess I'm interested in the perspective of a local community or a country in Latin America or in Africa, where they're presented with the option, the choice of dealing with the West that brings all these norms of human rights and so on, or dealing with China that brings in a lot of money. And so that's a very different kind of choice.
It's a very difficult choice to make that. If I'm an artisanal miner in the DRC, I want to sell my product. So then I don't want necessarily the regulations. I'm not interested in the regulations. I just want to be able to sell my product. And if the West comes with fancy regulations and that is keeping me from selling my product because they're concerned about biodiversity, frankly, I couldn't care. That is the honest truth. So these are very difficult, complex, nuanced questions to which I don't have the answers. I'm from Africa, so I understand the perspective, but I don't have an answer for you.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hello. Thank you very much for this. I'm glad I came. I learned something new. You mentioned that most of the refining capabilities in the mining sector are Chinese. So I guess my question is, how can, China's main adversaries in this case, Western countries, what kind of potential do they have to get that edge back in terms of refining capabilities?
So this is a gradual process. It won't happen overnight. But there is hope. I've seen, for instance, there's a company called Lifezone Metals, which is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. They're mining, I forget what, in Tanzania. One of the battery metals in Tanzania. But Tanzania put a requirement on the mining license that said you can only mine it if you also build a refinery, which for an African country is huge. Because what normally happens in Africa is the crude gets taken out and gets shipped out of the continent to be refined elsewhere. And the real value add is in the refining process. So if Africa can have refining places, then it helps them make their economies stronger as well. So this is the way to go.
Sir, I really appreciate your presentation. You didn't mention Russia at all in the role of Wagner
Yes.
Group in many of these mineral-intensive areas of Africa,
Yes.
which is accelerating. Are they part of China's strategy, or is it an independent operation, or how do you see it?
Thank you so much for that question. I think we are going to see the G7 versus the BRICS plus. So yes, I think Russia is part of that bigger strategy. I'm not an expert, but according to what I read, the BRICS plus are coming up with an alternative currency to the dollar. And of course, Russia is a stronghold of minerals. I don't think it's so coincidental that they were attacking Ukraine, which is such a strong producer of many critical minerals. The only reason why Canada is now the world's #1 producer of potash is that it used to be the Ukraine, and now they are in war. So there are several other minerals that the Ukraine is very strong in. So yes, absolutely, I agree with you.
Can I interject and ask, just related to that question? In the 80s, Canada was one of the major producers of almost all of these critical minerals, and yet I'm looking at the charts that you were providing, and North America seems to have fallen right off.
Yes.
First of all, what has happened to the Canadian productivity in this context, and where does this place us in the larger geopolitical environment that you have so well outlined?
What has happened to the Canadian context is a lot of mergers and acquisitions. So many of the Canadian mines have been bought out by foreign entities. We see now the use of the Canada Investment Act, but it's mostly being used against China. It's not being used against, say, South Africa when Goldfields comes in and wants to purchase a mining company. We're not really looking after our own. If we look at the mega mines that we used to have, Barrick, for instance, is not really a Canadian mine anymore. It's now a South African mine. They're still listed on the stock exchange, but it was a reverse listing by the South African company into Barrick. We lost Yamana, which is a big gold company, but we lost several mines over the past few years. And it's only now that the country is starting to say we will look after critical minerals projects. The 3 that I know of that have been stopped are all lithium concerns, and all of them were Chinese companies trying to purchase the lithium mines. I don't know that that's a solution for the whole problem.
Sir.
I was wondering about the remedy against vulture capitalism that the Chinese practice. And I was wondering if they were to, a scenario where they were to, say, attack Taiwan, the G7 could say to the world that it's most appropriate if you expropriate all of the Chinese ownership in your country. That would be quite an acceptable thing, and you wouldn't get a black eye internationally.
I think that question is above my pay grade. I really like your strategy, but I don't know.
But you're a lawyer.
That is why I'm careful.
Any other questions? Yes?
As someone from the global south, I wonder if there's a difference when it comes to the approach from China and the approach of other Western countries like Canada and United States when it comes to the dynamics with these countries that have critical minerals. How does this play out? If there's any difference at all in their approaches when it goes to the relationship with the government and the communities?
There's a big difference. And the problem is that the Western countries, the global north, likes to be tremendously prescriptive to the global south in this very paternalist way. And I say this having been part of an electricity supply negotiation in Mozambique in my previous life as in-house legal counsel. And I was part of a World Bank concession negotiation, and I saw how this operated. It is unbelievable to see how the global north just wants to impose their laws, whether they fit within the culture and the legal context of the southern country or not, just out of a sense of moral superiority. Now, this is the one thing that China does not do. China doesn't prescribe laws, it doesn't prescribe policy. It's easy to deal with them, and it's quick. I have some wonderful quotes from, I think it's the president of Sudan, who said, if I want to do business with China, and I'm paraphrasing, if I want to do business with China, we meet, it's 3 days, and the deal is done. Yes, there are other strings. I'm not saying there are no strings. There are other strings. But they get the money and the deal is done. And there's no moral proselytizing. This notion that the global north knows what is good for the global south is a very pernicious one, and one that offends many countries in the global south. And if you go in with that attitude, then obviously you are at a disadvantage in negotiating contracts. And I don't know how many people realize that.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment on if similar patterns were arising in places like South and Central America, whether or not, if they are to arise, the United States would not get a reaction to similar moves happening over the course of their own backyard.
They do arise in Latin America. I was at a conference very recently where several Latin American lawyers were speaking as well. And they are busy, they're open for business with China. They are saying their governments are actively pursuing agreements with China. They haven't yet, I'd say Africa is more mature. They've learned some hard lessons with China already, and they're starting to be a bit more careful now. Latin America hasn't yet learned those lessons. So they are very much at the open for business courting stage with China.
Can you just say a couple of comments relating to that? As I think about both the Chinese efforts in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, of course, that then ties to the Silk Road Initiative. Mm-hmm. How central is, in fact, the Silk Road Initiative within the context of critical minerals, or is the Silk Road all about critical minerals?
It's all about critical minerals. Well, it's all about the One China policy and the Great Chinese Rejuvenation policy. So you have a few interrelated Chinese policies, of which the Belt and Road Initiative is such an important part. But if you look what they've done in China, in Africa, and what they're busy doing in Latin America now, they're constructing infrastructure, right? So the infrastructure that they are busy constructing, railroads, ports, and then they're making concessions in terms of which they're getting mines, this all ties together. Because you need the infrastructure to convey the goods, the ore that you are taking out from the mine. You need to get that to port in order to get it back to China. So there are big cross-continent railways that they are doing in both Africa and in China. And it's a massive project, the like of which the West simply does not have, the like of which a vision the West does not have. And I'm saying that with no small amount of admiration.
Any last questions? Okay, seeing none, I'd like to take this time to thank Elizabeth for, I think, bringing to our attention an issue area that's just going to become even more critical for Canada as we head into increasing potential for conflict with both the Chinese and the Russians. When we think about the experience, of course, of the metaphor that she has provided us with the Roman Empire, I think it's very telling in terms of the route that is going forward, and this is something definitely that I know I will be following very closely. So on behalf of the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, Elizabeth,